morning. This is DK Marley, the Hist Fic Chickie. On today's episode, we are welcoming Jean Gill. She is an award-winning Welsh writer and photographer living in the south of France with two scruffy dogs, a beehive named Endeavour, a Nikon D750, and a man. For many years, she taught English and was the first woman to be secondary head teacher in Wales. She is mother or stepmother to 5 children, so life was hectic. Join Jean's special readers group at jeangill.com for private news and exclusive offers. Her series, The Troubadours, is like Game of Thrones with real history. Estella de Menton would give anything to be a troubadour. She becomes a pawn in a perilous game of queens, reliant on her golden voice and a dagger hidden beneath her skirts. Scarred by the Crusades, Dragonette Sluspross now fights with sword and song for a more enlightened world, where faith has no color. When he meets the runaway girl in a ditch, the whole world changes. The review from Leila Michael of the SB Review, she says, believable, page-turning, and memorable. Historical fiction at its best from Karen Charlton, the Detective Lavender series. Historical Novel Society's Editor's Choice, finalist in the Wishing Shelf Awards and the Chaucer Awards, winner of the Global eBook Awards for Best Historical Fiction. Jean, thank you so much for being here today. To get the interview started, maybe you can tell us the best writing tip you can think of for authors first starting out, something that has helped you.
I always stop writing when I know what I'm going to write next. And that way, when I sit down again the next day, I'm straight into it and I never get writer's block. It works for me.
Wow, that's a really good piece of advice. I've never thought about doing that. I might try that. Thanks for that. Well, let me ask you this. What are some common traps for aspiring writers? What's some advice that you can give for young writers starting out?
Very few aspiring writers realize the importance of editing what they've written. I think we all enjoy getting lost completely in the writing process, and it is a great achievement to finish a novel, a poem, whatever piece of work you actually had in your mind. But then the hard work starts, editing. And however much work you put into redrafting and editing, you do need somebody else helping you create the finished piece of work, because you don't see what's in front of you. You see what you meant to be there. You also need to beware the sharks out there. There are many, many people who want to make money from writers' hopes. It helps tremendously to network with other writers, a mixture of those who are starting out, to encourage, to share, to learn from each other, but also experienced writers who can warn you who to avoid and who is really not worth paying for the services they say they offer you. Be careful.
That is so very true. And talking about networking with other authors and having a team of support behind you, what other authors are you friends with, and how do they help you become a better writer?
There are so many that I couldn't possibly name them all, and I'd miss somebody out. But I have 2 very close groups of writer friends. One group is called The Sanctuary, and that just about sums up what we offer each other, a place where we can talk freely as writers and share all our experiences, whether they're personal or whether they're to do with marketing or book success or book failures or when we need encouragement. And the other group of friends, we chat together and also offer encouragement. We are the first to read each other's books and feedback so that we can offer early redirection in that horrible editing process that I hate so much.
Yeah.
And we trust each other. That's true of all my friends. And that's important for getting both encouragement and critical feedback when you need it. We share all that we discover on marketing, which is very helpful. And some of my inspiration has come from friends regarding books. So I'm going to name Babs Morton, who writes as B.A. Morton, because I told her about my experience of being stung by bees, having made mistakes with the beehives. I know why I was stung. And she said, wouldn't it be wonderful if you had superpowers after being stung?
Yes.
You should write the story. And that thought stayed in my mind, so that when the other ideas regarding nature, humans, the gap between the two, all came together, I kept picturing the girl who was stung by 1,000 bees and woke up with powers. Unfortunately, I didn't wake up with powers at all, but never mind. Maybe one day.
Maybe one day, yes. Well, talking about your other friends that are authors, can you give us a quick review of a favorite book by one of your author friends?
I don't so much have favourite books as favourite authors, but one of those, and someone I'm very proud to call a friend, is Jane Davis. Her last book, At the Stroke of 9 o'clock, was set in London between 1949 and 1955 and culminates in the scandal, the trial, and the last hanging of a woman in England, the trial of Ruth Ellis. That forms a backdrop to the lives of three very different women and the exploration of women's lives through the stories and this public event that brings them all together is totally gripping. And what fascinates me is that was the year I was born, and I'm totally immersed in what women's lives were like at that time,
right,
with all the legal prejudice against them, at the same time as some notion that it was unthinkable for a woman to commit a crime. Therefore, Ruth Ellis seemed to attract so much vitriol that wouldn't have been directed in the same way against a man. Fascinating novel, superb period detail, and great story. So that's At the Stroke of 9 o'clock by Jane Davis.
Oh, thank you for that review, and also a suggestion of something that we might be able to read along with yours. What's something that you would have told your younger self if you could go back and tell when you were first starting out in your writing?
I would say, keep writing and keep believing. It will happen for you one day. You will receive fan mail from readers who have loved everything you've written. Don't let that pile of rejections convince you that it's not worth it.
Right. Thank you for that. And did publishing your first book change your process of writing at all?
When I self-published my first book, I became far more aware of the order in which all aspects of making a book is best done in order to tell people about the book. Before I self-published, the title was the last thing that I thought of for a book because ideas would come to me while I was writing. But after I self-published, I realized that I couldn't have a cover without having a title. I couldn't have a cover without having a description of the book. And without a cover, I couldn't show people what book was coming next. So I started to become a little bit more organized in thinking out the publishing stages of a book while I was writing, so that I could get a cover to show people before I reached the end of the book. You don't have to know the ending in order to have enough material to get people interested in what's coming. And if you don't do that, then you're adding another 6 months, 8 months, a year before you can bring a book out, because cover designers are busy people, editors are busy people. You have to plan everything more in advance and realize that other people are involved in all of this, particularly your readers. If you want them to know what you're doing, you have to be a little bit more aware of what you're doing yourself.
Very, very true. And I know you said earlier about how important it is to have an editor. What is the best money you've ever spent as a writer? Is it, or was it on an editor or on a book cover designer?
On my cover designer, Jessica Bell Designs, and on my editor, Lorna Ferguson of Fiction Fire Press. They are both top professionals, and what they bring to my books adds a dimension that I would not be capable of myself, and that I've not found when I was traditionally published. It raises indie publishing to the level of what you're prepared as a publisher to give to your books.
Right, and I agree with that. A book cover, I was in graphic design for a really long time, so I completely understand that about catching the eye with a book cover. So spending money on that is very valuable for a traditional publisher and indie. But I've seen a lot more indie covers that I've really liked over traditional. Well, what kind of research do you do, and how long do you spend researching before beginning a book?
My Natural Forces series involves a bee shifter and a bear shifter. So I read quite a lot of non-fiction books about bees and about bears. Writing from the point of view of a bee was easier than a bear because I'm a beekeeper. So I started off with more knowledge about bees and their habits than I did about bears. But it was an interesting experience, although I didn't spend nearly as long on the research as I did for my historical fiction. For one of the 12th century historical novels, for each one in my quartet, I've spent a year researching very specific historical background because they're set in 1150, 1151, 52 and 53. And most non-fiction historical books cover about 400 years and call it medieval history, which is no good when I'm being as precise as that.
Right.
So I have to collect a lot of books, trawl to find out the bits that are relevant to me. And I listened to a lot of the Troubadours music and looked at the manuscripts and the art of the time. So that also puts you into the period, the way of thinking, the way of looking, and inspires you while you're writing.
Yes. Well, now I'm up to my favorite question to ask authors. What was an early experience where you learned that language had power?
I believed in magic when I was a little girl. Well, don't tell anybody, but I still do. And I used to make up spells that I was convinced would have impact on the world around me, even if nothing was ever proved. I do remember when I was about 6, I think, my parents had really annoyed me about something. And I wrote, "I hate you" on a little bit of paper and hid it behind the curtain in their bedroom. I can't remember what they did, so it can't have been too awful, and I hope they understood a child's point of view on such things, but I don't believe they were very pleased, that's for sure. So I always thought that spells and words had a lot of power if you wielded them properly.
Wow. Well, let me ask you this. Let's get kind of back to the business of writing. What do you think is the best way to market your books? Because I know a lot of authors struggle with this. So what's your advice on this?
The way that suits you, your life, your aims, your budget. If you enjoy being on Facebook, then you can reach people through Facebook. But if you try and be on all the social media talking about your books non-stop, you're going to hate yourself and nobody's going to be interested. So find a way that fits in with who you are and what you do. With regard to paid advertising, don't gamble more than you can afford to lose. There are too many gurus out there telling you that they know how you can sell your books via Amazon, via BookBub, via Facebook. And it's very easy to experiment with all these things, and they eat your money. That's what they do. It's another casino that feeds on the book world. But it is a way of reaching people if you're careful about what stakes you put on and what you expect to get back. Word of mouth is wonderful, but there are so many millions of books out there that it doesn't mean your book isn't good enough. If it's not being seen by people, then you'll never know whether you could reach readers. So do a little of what you find works for you, and each time your book bounces higher and becomes more visible, it'll bounce higher again the next time you have a promotion or you reach new readers. Author newsletter swaps are a lovely way of reaching other people's readers. But again, the market is saturated with books. You can't read all the books you're swapping with.
Right.
And it takes a lot of time when you could be writing.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing to do is to write enough books that you can have fun playing with the marketing.
That's very true. Well, have you read anything that made you think differently about fiction or historical fiction?
Everything I read contributes to ideas about what's possible in writing fiction. 2 of the novels in Pandora's box set by my writer friends Jane Davis and Carol Cooper have so many points of view, something I would never have risked before reading their novels. But it works so well, and that gives me ideas of what I could do if it was the right thing for the right book. Mm-hmm. And each time I read something creative, inventive, that tests the boundaries, challenges what you think is the set way of doing things, yes, it gives you far more ideas of what you could do with your own books.
Right. I remember going to a writer's retreat one time, and they stressed that if you write a good story, then rules can be broken. So I love that you have found that same kind of ideal for challenging yourself. I do the same thing, and I'm even pushing myself. I want to push myself even further than what I've already done. Well, do you read your book reviews, and how do you deal with good or bad ones?
I do read my book reviews, and I try not to dwell on the bad ones, although I do note any criticisms that I feel I could learn from. Mostly, it's that the books don't fit the reader. And sometimes that's my fault for writing a description that doesn't make it clear what sort of a book it is. So somebody who is looking for a romance where boy meets girl, there's obstacles, at the end they're happily ever after, is never going to like my books. And that it's up to me to mark it properly so that they realize I don't write that sort of book. Mm-hmm. I do very much like the reviews that come from the Wishing Shelf Award, in which I've been a finalist a few times now. And the library panels consist of, if you like, ordinary readers who discuss all the books. And the report that goes to the authors has many comments in it from all the discussions that took place. And I particularly love the ones from teenage library panels because they're honest. The criticism is helpful. One of my books, the youngsters said that the middle was boring. And the praise is just so moving because it's from the heart. When they tell you they loved a character, they loved the bees, or that they couldn't stop reading, you know that that is as honest as it gets from real readers. Very, very much enjoy reading those.
That's awesome. I've never thought about that. That's a really good way of getting true and honest book reviews. Well, in writing historical fiction, a lot of people have ideas about the ethics about writing about historical figures. What is your advice on this, or what is your thoughts on writing about historical figures?
It's easier for me as I write about the 12th century, and nobody living now is going to take offence if I portray a real historical character as a villain. And Shakespeare certainly had no qualms whatsoever about taking a political stance when he was writing about real historical figures like Richard III.
Right.
There are, however, ethical considerations for me with regard to the portrayal of racial and faith issues of the times I'm writing about. And I've made every effort to research the different faiths of my period and place, which were the Muslim faith, the Jewish faith, the Christian faith, all clashing with each other, although individuals crossed those faith barriers and were trading partners and friends. And within my books, I have tried very hard to avoid the stereotyping of the Crusaders are the goodies, which gets on my nerves when I read it in other books. That's something that I think is unacceptable nowadays.
Right.
We should be showing complex points of view and crossing those barriers, which weren't barriers at the time. There were times when certain regions and faiths were allies, and there were times when they were enemies. But individuals have always crossed those borders, and you'll find it in the primary sources of the time.
I very much agree with you on that. My story, Child of Love and Water, deals with those breaking barriers, and how there was people even at that time in the 18th century that I wrote about, who broke those barriers during the times of slavery and colonial Georgia. Well, let me ask you this. What do you think is the most difficult part of your artistic process, or something that would challenge a person in their process?
Editing. I know I said how important it is, but I hate it. I hate going back to the book I thought was so wonderful when I wrote it and finding that it's full of crap. And then I have to spend hours and hours rewriting, trying to tell myself it'll be all right. And then gradually I find out it's not so bad after all. And that if I keep working on it, it might even be quite good. And that by the time I get it to my professional editor, I've rediscovered what I liked about the book. But that first dive in where I hate it is gut-wrenching. And I don't think I'll ever get over that.
Right.
I never edit until I've finished writing the book, because if I did, I'd get so depressed I wouldn't write it at all.
I agree. And then there's those times when then you have to completely cut out something that you thought was essential to the story, and a big chunk goes away, and that's really hard to deal with, or a character that you have to completely get rid of. It's hard. It's a really hard thing. Well, now we're to the part where we're going to give you the floor, and we'd like for you to tell us about your novel and series and why you wrote about this topic.
The Troubadour series starts with Song at Dawn, and the main character at the start is a young girl who wants to be a troubadour and is taken up as a protégée by Queen Aliena of Aquitaine. She gets tangled up in court politics and is mentored by the Queen's commander, an ex-crusader who has a troubled history of his own that he's trying to come to terms with. The story began because I was reading troubadour poetry, and the introduction to one of these books of poems said that there was a rumour that there was a female troubadour touring the south of France with a large white dog. Now, as I live in the south of France, have written and published poetry, and have been loved by and owned by 6 Pyrenean mountain dogs, the whole idea of this troubadour from the 12th century fascinated me. And I knew I had to write her story. So the whole story began with a girl running away from some horrible background and waking up in a ditch with the big white dog who'd followed her. And that's how the story begins. And then as I wrote, I found all the other pieces in the story coming together, and I became very, very interested in what had happened to this Crusader knight, which had left him so damaged. The history of the troubadours themselves is interesting because it was rewritten in Victorian England and sanitized, whereas the actual poems themselves are bawdy, disgusting, very clever, very sexy, and they were the rock stars of their time. So sex, drugs and medieval ballads were part of the lives that they lived. They were also the reporters, because as they travelled, they would report on the news of the day and turn it into song. There were two kinds of troubadours: the ones who actually created the songs and sometimes sang them, and those who merely sang other people's songs, cover versions, if you like. The Estella within the novels wants to be a troubadour, but she has to begin by singing other people's songs. And that's the stage that she comes into the limelight in the first novel in the series, but she grows as the series develops.
That's really fascinating. So can you tell us your favorite line or passage from your own book?
In 12th century Occitania, what's now the south of France, women could hold power, they could inherit, they could rule. And within the story of Song at Dawn, there are two very powerful women. Everybody knows about Eleanor of Aquitaine, but Ermengarda of Narbonne was a ruler in her own right from the age of 4, and someone who was crucial to the politics between that part of what's now Spain and what's now the south of France. And I've chosen a passage that tries to bring out the sort of person she was, as I imagine her. In this part of the story, she and Aliénor are visiting a house in the Jewish quarter and trying to have a light-hearted party where their fortunes are told. But one of the Jews in the house says, "The tradition does not permit women to be party to our mysteries." There was a gasp from Aliénor, and Dragonets closed his eyes, the conflagration real in his head. Instead, the ruler of Narbonne, golden and indisputably female, accepted the insult and moulded it into a nugget of power. "Much like the Christians, then," she observed mildly, "and I shall bear that in mind in future." Everyone in that room knew a threat when he heard one, including the hapless Jew caught between tenet and termagants.
Oh, that was beautiful and powerful. Well, let me ask you this. Since you've just told us your favorite line or passage, can you also tell us what was the hardest scene for you to write?
A character that I'd come to care about very much dies within the story. And I found that very hard to write because I wanted to assert my control as an author and bring him back to life, not let him die, change what happened. But every time I thought about the story, it felt to me that that was how it went. Everything about the death was inevitable. It didn't make it any easier to write, and I cried buckets while writing it. And I think many authors feel that sense of the rightness of the story, preventing us giving some element of everybody being happy at the end that a reader might feel they want. But then, if it wasn't true to the story, it wouldn't work for the reader either.
Thank you for sharing that with us. And the reason why your books are referred to as the Game of Thrones with actual history. Well, now we're to the end of the interview, and we would love for you to tell us your favorite quote and how the quote tells us something about you.
I live in France, and there's a French singer I like very much called Francis Cabrel. And one of the lines in one of his songs really spoke to me, and I printed it out and kept it on my desk for many years, but it's still in my head. He wrote, "Faut pas dire à qui je ressemble, faut dire qui je suis." And roughly translated, that means, let's not say who I'm like, let's say who I am. And I think for many authors, you are always being compared to somebody else, someone more famous, someone more important. And it's really crucial for us as authors to find our own voices, for people to say, that's a Jean Gill, or that's so typical of Jean Gill, rather than say she's like somebody else. So I'm very happy to be discovering who I am, how I write, and to have my own voice, not to be compared to somebody else.
Very, very true. And thank you for that. Thank you so much for being my guest today. We all truly enjoyed getting to know you. And to all my listeners, Jean's books, the Troubadour Series, which there's 6 books in the series, is now available at Amazon and also at a new place to purchase historical fiction books. You can visit www.thehistoricalfictionpress.com, where you will find a new bookshop exclusively for historical fiction. The website is brand new, so we are still in the process of fixing glitches and adding more books and book links, so please be patient. But also take a look and browse our virtual aisles. Again, that is www.thehistoricalfictionpress.com, or you can find our Facebook group at www.facebook.com/groups/thehistoricalfictionbookshop. Once again, thank you so much, Jean. We really enjoyed having you here today. Thank you for listening, and this is DK Marley, the Hist Fic Chickie. Have a great day and find a little slice of history to read about in your next read.